evening. Hi. Wow, it's a beautiful audience. A lot of people here today. That's excellent. Thank you so much for coming out. I'd like to welcome you today to the partnership between PEN Melbourne and the Wheeler Centre. The title of today's talk is Writing in Exile. It's the first in a series, and the writer in exile that we will be speaking to today is Mahmoud Aidani. My name is Sami Shah. I'm going to be your host this evening. And just a little bit about PEN Melbourne itself as an organization. It's one of 147 PEN international centers worldwide whose members are united in a common concern for the art of writing and freedom of expression. The area of focus is always on writers and people of the word who are imprisoned, who are persecuted, who are suffering for their work. And to be able to be a part of the organization is a huge privilege because it means that you believe in the power of the written word, and you believe in the power of freedom of speech. And these are such cherished values in not just our society, but around the world. And organizations like PEN Melbourne, in association with the Wheeler Centre, make all the difference in fighting for the writers, as you're going to see today, from so many of them that have benefited or just have had their voices heard through places like PEN. Before we begin, I'd like to just make a few announcements. One is that PEN Melbourne runs on donations and also has a lot of information that you would find valuable. So at the back, we will have a donation bucket on the way out. You can drop some change in there, anything you got rattling around in your pockets. That would be wonderful. And also, if if you want to learn more about PEN, we've got the quarterly magazine in the back, and we also have quite a few copies of Mahmoud's work as well. So you can please partake of those before you leave the building. PEN Melbourne acknowledges the traditional owners of the land, the Bunwurrung and Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, and recognizes that sovereignty of this land was never ceded. PEN Melbourne pays respect to elders, both past, present, and emerging, to their culture and their continuing connection to land and community. Mahmoud Aidani left Iran soon after the 1979 February Revolution. He's never been able to return home and has been living in exile ever since. And when he speaks to you shortly, he will be explaining the gravitas and the importance behind that word, exile, and how often it is misunderstood or misused, and what it actually means to him personally. He is an acclaimed poet and playwright, as well as a distinguished academic. His research is concerned with Middle Eastern peoples, including and especially Iranians, who have experienced violence or torture and have resettled in the West. Aidani will discuss censorship, creativity, and isolation today, and it'll be a pleasure to hear him do all of that. But first, whenever PEN Melbourne has a public event, they always have an empty chair. And that empty chair has a certain significance behind it. And to explain that significance, I'd like to invite on stage our Writers in Prison officer, Josephine Scicluna. Thank you very much.
PEN International works on behalf of writers who are silenced for carrying out the peaceful practice of their profession. Many writers and journalists knowingly defy censorship and scorn prohibitions for causes that are beyond their own personal advantage. Clearly, truth-telling is a dangerous business. Each year, PEN campaigns for many writers around the world who are unjustly harassed, imprisoned, tortured, or murdered with impunity in order to suppress the injustices their writing brings to light. So it is fitting that here, where we write without fear of persecution, we think of our fellow writers who do not share the fundamental human right of freedom of expression. The empty chair on the stage today is for a writer who cannot share this platform, Razan Zeitouneh, a human rights advocate from Syria, who, along with 3 other activists, was abducted on December 9th, 2013. By armed gunmen presumed to be connected with the Army of Islam. In March 2011, when violent suppression followed pro-democracy demonstrations, Razan remained in Syria to advocate for democratic reform and non-violent solutions. She co-founded a broad coalition of Syrians to exchange information, broadcast eyewitness accounts, and expose atrocities on YouTube and Skype. In 2014, she was awarded the Vital Voices Global Trailblazer Award. I now welcome Mahmoud Aidani to the stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. It's so thrilling to be here in this place where people care about ideas. I'm here to speak with you as an Australian citizen and an exiled from my birthplace, Iran. Firstly, I want to acknowledge and pay my deepest respect to the traditional owners and elders, both past and present, of this land and the waters. Before I delve into my presentation, let me thank the PEN Melbourne committee, whose members are here, of course, who acknowledged that we urgently needed to have discussions regarding the exile, which I think is missing in our public discussions. I recall our first committee meetings in 2018 when I raised the significance of exile and expressed my deep concerns regarding the absence of such conversations about this figure in our contemporary time, and emphasized that we needed a national and international discourse on this subject. I am delighted that PEN Melbourne, with partnership with agreed with me, and here we are. I also wish to extend my gratitude to the Wheeler Centre for hosting such an important event, and of course, thank you all for coming today. I hope my presentation and my contribution to this topic will be beneficial to you all. I hope that today is an opportunity for us to consider thinking deeper about the notion of exile and being in exile, without lapsing into cultural, relativistic perspectives and attitudes, and that we will continue to engage in serious and vigorous conversations on being in exile beyond this event. I think if we pay very close attention to the state of the world we live in, we realize how much we live in a consciously cruel world. I believe if we fight cultural relativism mindset, this will enormously help the plight of millions of people who are deeply traumatized and suffering at the hands of dictators who have been subjugating them to their absolutist ideas and values. And us who resist them by fighting back and risk our lives by expressing our thoughts, writings, and actions. For a long time, I have been deeply concerned about the concept of exile and how it is claimed by those who perceive themselves as exiled, and hence in exile from their homeland. Existentially and ethically, exile is a very important and challenging concept, and I believe it needs to be seriously addressed and given close attention in all areas of the arts, as well as related discourses within the domains of philosophical, social, cultural, political, and scientific engagement and other endeavors. I want to dedicate this presentation to all Iranian writers and thinkers who have been imprisoned, tortured, murdered, disappeared, and exiled. These thinkers and artists have made great sacrifices and endured tremendous pain and suffering. With such tenacity and determination, they have struggled against repression and dictatorship, fought for democracy and freedom of speech in Iran, our country of birth. Lived experience, thinking, judging, and action are closely linked with being in the world. Mansour Sepanlu, an exiled Iranian, recently said that the mere fact of the existence of the Iranian Islamic regime is constant torture to us. And I would like to add to this that whoever denies this fact does not know anything about the absence of freedom and democracy in Iran, as well as his or her ethical and moral responsibility towards fighting against such a repressive and medieval theocratic regime. Exile is against forgetting the violence and injustice that oppressors inflict upon the citizens of the society from which one has exiled. History has shown us that the dictators and enemies of human flourishing are enemies of human flourishing and happiness. We know as a fact that governments that do not subjugate the citizens to the brutal will in order to maintain power help flourish democracy and openness in their society. They open great human potential for their citizens, bring happiness, self-confidence, and prosperity to the people. I'm afraid we have never experienced such a thing in Iran. And I can say it with confidence in the entire Middle East region so far. Now, let me pose a few questions. Who is claiming, defining, representing, and owning a concept called exile in our present times? And this question also goes for other concepts that refers to, for example, the other, isolation, alienation, empathy, care, repression, suffering, pain, trauma, just, marginalized, excluded, justice, freedom, equality, inclusion, integrity, authenticity, fairness, courage, and so on. What are we doing with these powerful concepts in our extremely violent and troubled times? And what are the reasons and justifications which allow us to employ them in order to discuss the experiences we go through in our lives in the world in which we live? Are we applying an authentic moral vision and ethical value to these concepts? Oppressors and those who dominate us constantly either implicitly or explicitly tell us that we are powerful and can create our own reality, and you, that means us, have to accept it. They force us to believe that their religious, cultural, racial, ideological, and worldviews are embedded with truth. Therefore, they are the ones who possess the true meaning of the truth. In 1979, I participated in a revolution which defied the absolutist thinking. This absolutist thinking and this revolution changed the course of the whole social, political, religious, historical, and ideological circumstances of my birthplace, and indeed the entire Middle East and the world. In February 1979, the Iranians replaced the dictatorial regime of the Shah for another one. This was not my intention when I took great risks and participated in the revolution. I simply wanted to be free in order to express my thoughts without being subjected to any threats, harassment, arrest, imprisonment, and torture. When I took that risky decision to participate in the revolution and stood up against the brutal forces of the Pahlavi regime, that's the Shah, I wanted to end the social, cultural, and economic inequality and the ethnic divisions and achieve equal rights and respect for myself and millions of other Iranians in a free and open society in which I was dreaming to continue to live in. I simply wanted to achieve all of these things in order to be able to fulfill my love and passion for writing and freedom of expression. But this dream was shattered very soon after 1st February 1979, when Ayatollah Khomeini returned from Paris and addressed the nation as a savior. It was after then and the subsequent 3 months after that that I came to conclude that the dream I nurtured for most of my life was not going to be possible under the new regime's fundamentalist rulers either. As a matter of fact, I immediately began to think that life under this regime, this new regime, was going to be even worse than the previous one. And I was right. the immediate escalation of the violence, arrest, the execution of opponents, ethnic violence, ideological infightings, the speed of theocratic domination, the will to create a closed and repressive environment, the imposition of a regime which did not have any respect for human dignity, freedom of expression, modernity, respect for human rights, diversity, open society and democracy, which was leading Iranian society into deep crisis, shocked and deeply disturbed me. I witnessed all of these events firsthand in those early months of the establishment of the theocratic regime 4 decades ago. 40 years later, Iran has not made any progress on any of these human rights issues. It continues to arbitrarily arrest, torture, and execute anyone who defies its ideology. Experiencing and witnessing those traumatic events and becoming the subject of threats, harassment, and abuse forced me to decide to leave the most precious things in my life: my family, friends, the city, and the dreams I cherished, to live in a free and democratic Iran to which I belong. I was determined to develop myself as a free-thinking individual who read, wrote, and pursued and nurtured my love for literature, philosophy, and theater. I was born and raised in poverty. Because of the social, economic circumstance of my family, like most other poor Iranians, I experienced systematic economic inequality, marginalization, and discrimination. I was harassed and beaten by the Shah's regime's notorious secret police. In my youth, I was harassed and threatened and also beaten by the supporters of the new regime of Khomeini as well. I, with millions of Iranians, lost a revolution in which we took part, dreaming for a better life and a free society. I lost my city, Khorramshahr, during the war between Iran and Iraq, and became tragically separated from my loved ones and all my friends, many of whom were killed during the war. All these experiences have been harsh and devastating for me. However, one of the harshest and most devastating experiences I have been going through in my entire life has been the experience of exile. Exile is a harsh and crushing experience. The devastating thought that I may never be able to go back to the country, land of my birth, even though 40 years have passed, is still haunting. Living in exile breaks you. It totally uproots and vanishes you from the immediacy of your place and roots. It totally shakes the foundation of your being and transforms the meaning of the world in which you love and live every day that passes. It is one of the worst tragic falls you could face in your life. The aim of dictator is to crack you to their absolute will and use you as a tool in the powers of evil. Exile poses various drastic questions, options before you. It tries to trick and bargain with you. It's like Faustian deal. Let me talk about two of the options that exile poses. The first one is compromise. A compromise with the regime. In this option, you have to compromise your moral and ethical responsibilities as an authentic human being and submit to the emotional desire and temptation of going home and into the bosom of the dictator who has turned your country of birth into a big prison. Or the second option is to resist and fight them. Firstly, within yourself, and then out of yourself, with your thoughts and actions. I have chosen this one. Exile is not just a word and concept. It is real. It is directly imposed upon your existence, that is your life, by the oppressors and dictators who don't wish you and your people to be free and happy. Dictators wish the exile banishment. They wish them death, away from their birthplace and lands and nothing else. Exile is the most difficult examiner and harshest judge of your ethical and moral values as a human being. It perpetually demands you to be aware of your ethical responsibility. It also constantly reminds you about the true values regarding your stance in facing injustices imposed on yourself and others. Threats, arrest, interrogation, imprisonment, torture, and execution are all consequences which those who dare freely express the opposition to their oppressors' political system must endure. In my ordinary way, as an exiled person, I have been thinking, learning, adjusting, integrating, writing, grieving my indescribable losses, helping, gaining, contributing, loving, healing, and connecting with others, as well as nurturing my formidable hope and will to persist and be truthful to myself and my principle over 40 years. Exile. Who does claim it? I have nurtured one formidable belief that in order to confront and fight against oppressors, one must not compromise one's humanity and the ethical and moral values for justice and human rights. For me, if you claim that you are in exile, especially if you are a writer, artist, and a scholar, and know what it means to claim this special mode of existence in the world, one cannot go home until the home is free. I believe if you claim that you are in exile and decide to go home, this action is a clear indication that you have not only compromised your humanity against the torturous regime from which you claimed you fled, but also by the act of your return, you directly and consciously legitimize the brutality of that regime that imposes pain and suffering on the people inside the country where you come from. No, you do not sell yourself to the oppressors who control, imprison, torture, kill, and subjugate the entire population of the country of your birth to their absolute will in order to maintain their power at any cost. I would love to return to my country of birth. I come from one of the most ancient parts of the world and belong to one of the oldest civilizations. I was born into the language of the great prophet Zarathustra. Remember Nietzsche. Poets such as Omar Khayyam, who fascinated Edward Fitzgerald and the entire Victorian creative and intellectual era up to the 60s cultural and political movements in the West. The mystic poets such as Rumi, Hafiz, and Sadi. I know the marvelous stories of 1001 Nights, the love story of Layla and Majnun, and Shirin and Farhad. I have read Attar's great poetry, The Conference of the Birds, many times, just to name a few. Iran is a vast, diverse, and beautiful country. I was introduced to the magic stories of Epic of Gilgamesh in my childhood and was mesmerized hearing the story of the king's friendship with the wild Enkidu and how this story was created just near where I was born. I was so impressed years later when I read the epic in English to find out that it was written on the clay tablets around 2800 BC. I was in my 20s when I was also introduced the first play written in human history by Aeschylus, called The Persians, which was performed in 422 BC. This tragic play has deeply fascinated me to this day. Whilst the play is about Greek triumphalism over the defeated Persians, one cannot dismiss the lament and the grief of the suffering Persians in this play that Aeschylus gives voice to. In many ways, I think it resonates with our contemporary plight. And how can I not make reference to great Goethe and his magnificent collections of poems called West Eastern Divan, which were inspired by his love and affinity to our great poet, Hafiz. As most of you know, Iran has a great past. The archaeological evidence, which goes back to over 8,000 years, demonstrate how complex its great ancient cities, ways of life, cultivating lands, and political systems work. It is in the context of this background, the historical, cultural significance, and the richness of the civilizations of my birthplace, that my character and my individuality has been formed and shaped. I have always missed the land on which I was born. But since this theocratic regime has been in power in my birthplace, I have not been able to return back. So, in all these years, whatever my circumstances, I have always been learning, thinking, writing, and existing in exile. An exile cannot go home because she thinks of the ethic and morality of the implications of going home for an exile. These are violent and extremely dangerous times. We have to ask, who is in exile in our time? The authentic exile defies. They think and speak to power, both in their solitude and amongst those who are willing to listen and include them amongst themselves. The authentic exile is a passionate advocate for justice and freedom. The authentic exile is a free individual who, in her mode of being, despises any form of injustices imposed on innocent, powerless, and dispossessed people. The authentic exile's main concern is her own conscience. The authentic exile obtains tremendous self-belief, independence, and inner resources. He or she is enriched with resilience and authentic thinking and reasoning. In order to keep the dignity and self-respect, even when they may be or are ignored, neglected, disregarded, deliberately misunderstood, and excluded. At the heart of it all, the authentic exile is a happy human being, because at the core of their existence, they live with a clear and good conscience. The authentic exile detests bad conscience. The authentic exile detests drawing pitiful and charitable attention to his or her experiences and situations. The authentic exile does not speculate. He or she sees and speaks. The authentic exile knows that the word idea means to see, to face, to meet, be face to face. We stand before a thing, each other, a car, a tree, a chair. A political system, a poor man, an orphan child, a refugee and asylum seeker, a man or woman who has been tortured and has lost everything in the war. We are standing before the world. It stands before us. It faces us. We are in it. What is happening in this world? I'm finishing. The genuine happening occurs when we encounter each other face to face and tell the truth to each other. The authentic exile is the one who knows this so deeply, because he or she has faced the brutality of injustice and the violence of the oppressors who are determined to destroy his or her will to think authentically and be honest to himself and herself. It is all about seeing, thinking, judging, telling, and acting. Just imagine that you cannot return to the country you were born in because you think. Simply, because you think, write, criticize, and question the legitimacy of the oppressive regime which keeps the people of your birthplace captive to its absolute laws and control. Imagine being threatened and fearing your life, and you are all alone in a strange city and place. And you are having your movements monitored. And you tell yourself that for the sake of preserving my freedom and human dignity, I am not going to succumb to all these threats of intimidation. Imagine your mother and father die, and you are unable to attend their funeral simply because you say no to the destructive and dogmatic ideas, values, and brutal system of the regime that rules your birthplace. This has been my exilic life over the last 40 years. Thank you very much.
I'll have a short conversation with Mamad, and then after that, we will open the floor to questions. So if you have any of those, just keep them till the end. Thank you so much, Mamad.
A pleasure.
You need a sip of water?
Yes.
Yes. One of the things that comes up a lot when we talk about Iran today, because I want to place some sense of context around your story, is people see the Iran of today as one that's ruled by the Ayatollahs, who there's a severe form of Islam in practice over there as part of the government, and then they see pictures of the Iran before that, which it's always the same picture largely. It's young ladies in miniskirts going to colleges. It's people in clubs, in celebrating, things like that. But that was the Iran against which you first began your protest.
That's right.
It wasn't just the Ayatollah Iran. It was the Iran that came before that, which was ruled by a dictator named Reza Shah Pahlavi.
That's right.
Why was that Iran one that required protesting?
Well, there is nothing sacred than having freedom to express yourself freely. We were not free to express ourselves. We were imposed by a modern, almost puppet regime during the Shah. And we could not express ourselves in any form or shape. As a matter of fact, I mentioned it was even during his regime that I was arrested and beaten by its secret police because I expressed myself against its repressive policies and abuses of human rights and so forth and so forth. So, but in the background of that, we never imagined, at least the part of Iran where I come from, which is highly industrialized and modern in South, imagine that we will inherit such a brutal fundamentalist regime. So soon after that, I realized, as I indicated, that the savior is not this particular person. I didn't support Khomeini, but so within that context, I think he came and definitely ambushed and hijacked and played the greatest psychological game with millions of Iranians who were repressed and poor. And once they galvanized it, the brutalities began to show, which is far, far worse than Shah, as I indicated, and it still continues.
So when's the exact moment that you knew you had to leave your homeland?
When I was beaten by my best friend who became one of the heroes. And he didn't do anything to me during the revolution. but I just was skeptical from the beginning. And also I saw bodies of individuals on my streets, my city's streets, being hanged because it was so brutal that if you had any personal enmity or complaint, you just finger. That was thug of another regime, and people were there to either banish you or kill you. So within that, I said, this is a very, very, very macabre place. I have to leave.
And the Iran of today, we see it in the news. There's stories of women pulling off their hijabs. There's stories of people finally fighting back against the regime. But then there's also stories, like we saw yesterday, of human rights activists being imprisoned for 30 plus years, of brutal lashings and of oppression and suppression. Still, will it change? Do you, from what you can see from now sitting outside?
This is my deep concern about the West, and that's why I mentioned that cultural relativistic. If you really do believe in human rights, as we do, not skeptic, but furiously question if you have any inclination to give any credit that something is happening in Iran. They are the master of disguise, this regime. And people push them, especially young people, they compromise. But the machine behind that has not changed since the day one. It kills in different forms a shape. So within that context, I think we should deeply look into the structure, the ideology of Iranian regime, which has not changed an inch.
So from the moment you're in Iran, you're a young man, you've now realized that the Iran that came before the revolution was violent. The Iran that's come after the revolution is even more violent, and there's no place for you there if you want to continue to live. How do you end up from there to Australia?
Well, I went to Italy with a group of friends after 4 months into the revolution, and I found I lived in Italy actually for 2 years, 2.5. And then the war broke out between Iran and Iraq, and my city was the first city which was invaded by Saddam Hussein's army. And as soon as the war began, I could not have any connection with my family. Then I realized, as a matter of fact, I watched Iraqis tanks entering into my city and destroying it. So it was quite bizarre. And after that, I just decided to come here, and some individuals who decided to help me, and I came over here.
So
that was in 1982.
So in 1982, you came straight to Melbourne?
No, I went to Sydney for 6 months.
And then you corrected that mistake and you came to Melbourne. You've always been fleeing the bad places. He said it. He said it. How do you make a life in Australia after being tortured, being abused, fleeing your homeland, watching your homeland, then being invaded by another country, and now you're here, and over here now, it's a very different life. It's a very different. The problems are of a much smaller scale. I'm
not a man of whinging, but Australia is not an easy society you find fantastic people. We're talking about Australia as a place, as a whole, not just wonderful individuals like this. It's not an easy place. It has a very thick skin. Maybe it took me years because I inserted myself into in-depth study of Western philosophy to understand if you know you're a citizen, you could be a bit sort of aloof and detached. But it's been very hard. But I'm not complaining in a sense. I don't have pathological problem. Intellectuals and thinkers should be skeptical. We all have difficulties, otherwise we wouldn't be here. My point is that it is democratic, but I'm very concerned about this democracy as well as a citizen. We have to be tougher. Our questions are not tough. We have these dangerous conferences. What is danger about thinking in open society? I wonder. But we have to push. It's fading away. Within that context, I'm saying it's tough. We could easily lapse into that sense of, yeah, I'm doing a great job. Now, democracy is always waiting to arrive. it was yesterday and it is today. What's happened tomorrow? I think we are not asking deep questions. We almost feel a bit anxious if someone asks us deep questions about this democracy. I'm very afraid of that. People take it responsibility. Sometimes I feel people like me to be around others seems to be unbearable. No wonder I become solitary and go away, because I don't want to bother people. I am bothered by democracy rather than individuals. We should not become too cocky. We shouldn't be too happy about what we do. Intellectuals should be, as I said, happy, but not happy in terms of commodity to make the friends feel good or bad. These ideas are not easy to. So I see them and I speak to them. And I blame myself because of that nasty background that I experienced. So, but I see myself as one of you, in a sense, because I'm a citizen and I love it. I've got a wonderful family, but it's a very complicated society. And I think it's harder for Middle Eastern, and as you know, there are stigmas attached to Iranians. Misunderstanding of the Middle East so deep. People talk about colonization, all those kind of things that we are aware. So they all are in the background as well, but I have overcome that somehow to be able to coexist with this very lovely, actually, open society. And I have very concern about its health, democracy, and cohesiveness.
You are a refugee. Now, in Australia, we've got a very conflicted relationship with that word. We have recently, for example, Hakeem Al-Arabi, who's from Bahrain, and he was a refugee we celebrated. We gave him a citizenship recently and fought to get him back from Thailand, from the Bahraini regime trying to capture him. We've had Ando, who's a national celebrity who's on ABC TV. His book is a bestseller, has been for ages now. But at the same time, we also have Manas and Nauru, and we have everything that happens there. From your experience, why is there that dichotomy in Australia? Why does Australia have this extreme relationship with the word refugee that goes from left to right and right to left so suddenly?
Yes. I'm in exile. I'm not a refugee anymore. Whoever is not happy who lives in those repressive societies, as far as I'm concerned, I don't have any problem. They could flee. And hopefully we are as generous as we can be to have them. But talking about these three experiences, from my point of view, I'm talking about myself, I think exile is the one who thinks constantly and thinks about thinking and keeps learning about this thinking and from others. The rest, whatever they do, good luck to them. Categories are very important. Intellectuals and thinkers are the ones who ultimately, if they're authentic, could have huge bearing, as they have shown us since Socrates, who could really bring us to this situation. But others, footballers, as a matter of fact, I love soccer very much. If they come, they should contribute to the arguments. They should fight why they fled from those countries. A footballer or not, I want them to sit everywhere and talk. And I'm sure Australia is ready for them. And unfortunately, most of refugees who I dearly support and care because of the humiliation that they experienced it, and they've never been able to learn, not because they are not wonderful people. Dictators don't allow you to learn. Cannot come and speak, and they misunderstood. So I can't make any sort of judgment about them, but I think I came here as someone who wanted to think. I wanted to freely learn to express myself. This is my crime. That's it. Whatever I achieved through my qualification years, and this thing that I speak against Iranian regime is just not screaming, not yelling, not abusing words. I just directly tell them, you are brutal. Your abuses of human beings is phenomenal. So within that context, I think I'm very interested in that figure.
You work with a lot of Iranian refugees today, and
lot.
you work with them in theater and arts. What are the contemporary Iranian refugee experiences like? What do you learn from them?
Here?
Yes.
The experience, of course, if you deal with those who almost, well, there are great numbers of them languishing in Nauru, but those who almost did and been lucky to come here, I think, don't get depressed. If you get depressed, it's your problem, I say. They're really having tough. They are having toughest time that you could imagine. They are damaged, they're squashed. I don't know. I've been doing my best, and many of them are slowly, through diligence and persistence and commitment that I have, and they are so keen to be with me and trusting me, we are doing some inwards. But the refugee who comes now is terribly damaged. We're all damaged, but they are awfully damaged. And so within that context, I think what we've been doing fantastic. Some of them actually are here tonight, as I recall. So yeah. So I'm adamant and keen and stubborn to a system. I get a lot out of it.
This is probably a redundant question given how stubborn you are, but going back in time
Yes.
to that moment when you first started arcing up against the regime, first the Pahlavi regime and then the Ayatollah's regime, do you think if you could do it again, if you could go back in time and do it over, would you do it differently? Would you stay quiet? Would you make an easier life so you could stay at home?
I would do it 100% even more. I just don't lack injustice. Simple. I just don't like it. Don't you? Well, they were brutal. We were born to live free. Nobody has the right to tell us to live the way that they want us to live. So within that context, I would be even more, if you call it stubborn, determined. And that's what I'm talking about. The exiled man concern is his conscience. And exiled detest. I do detest bad conscience. So within that context, well, if we don't do that, how can we actually galvanize our humanity to fight against these oppressors? Oppressors need to be fought against through ideas, through thoughts, and through determination, not dogmatic determination. And as a matter of fact, sadly, tragically, I have seen many of my compatriots who came to the West and claimed to be refugees or exile, and as soon as they got their citizenship, they went back. It's the most devastating thing. I have friends who were damaged in Europe by this action. So it's quite a tricky thing. It really affects you. I don't know if I change this attitude, I might commit suicide. As simple as that. Such a beautiful love. I am a very happy person because my conscience is clean. I don't need to play tricks or act double standard or high. Just this is it. But I have to work hard in order to be able to articulate myself through knowledge and through reasoning, not high floating emotional and fantastic views of religious or ideology or dogmatic things. I just don't have time for it. Well, I was 20, I didn't have those things, but I had the material to nurture. Thanks. The exile gave it to me, the opportunities, and here I am, expressing it in this beautiful language too.
And that's one of the benefits that you end up incurring inadvertently, is that coming here, being here now, suddenly you have exposure to, like you said, Western philosophy and to other things and to the arts and the theater that you didn't maybe have access to over there at the time. One of the things I always wonder is, when people ask you, what do you miss about home? Whenever they ask me, what do you miss about home, I'll always say, well, it's, you say the obvious things, you miss your family, you miss your friends, you miss the music and the arts, but it's also sometimes very specific things, like this one berry that you get there that you don't get anywhere else in the world, and it's only local to Pakistan, and it's called the falsa, and I would kill for it right now.
Oh, wow.
What do you miss about home that's specific to home?
Should I act as a comedian or as an exile?
Act as an exile.
I miss freedom in my country. nothing else. I do fundamentally miss the lack of freedom in my country. I said my country is beautiful. I was privileged to see it before I left. But this is what I think, I hope you get me. I profoundly miss the lack of freedom in my country. What I gain if I go to Iran? Well, firstly, I have to see the ruins of my town, totally destroyed still. And secondly, millions of people who are subjected to act in a double standard way because the oppression is so bad, you are forced not to be yourself. I'll be suicidal there. So I miss the lack of freedom in my country. And beyond that, you could read what I miss. Mm-hmm. Yes. I miss, for example, to give wonderful lectures at the University of Tehran or get one of my plays produced in one of the beautiful theaters. Well, those kind of things I miss. But again, if we understand philosophy and we're talking about lack of freedom, what kind of plays would I have to perform in my country? So, lack of freedom. But I know I get all those beautiful things that you're missing, foods and things, from Iranians here.
Yeah.
Yes, great. So they look after me.
We can open the floor to the questions at this time. I think we have around 10 minutes left to go. So we have two people with microphones on either sides. If you have a question, raise your hands, and they'll get to you the microphone if you speak into that. And my only request is that you keep it an actual question. Sometimes these things turn into monologues. So if you put a question mark at the end, we'd really appreciate that. Yeah, anyone? Oh, right here in the front.
Thank you to the Wheeler Centre for another fantastic evening tonight, and thank you to you too. I was here for Sami Shah a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him what he thought was the central problem in the Middle East. He told me it was the French and the English, the Sykes-Picot. I'm a little bit confused about that. Have you got a view on why the Middle East is so fractious?
Well, we all refer to these two particular British and French gentlemen who divided the Middle East into different pieces and decided to give whatever they like to each other. I'm not going to get into that, but I think one of the things that I've been thinking deeply, there is no doubt about the impact, the profound impact of colonizations of our region. The way that they monopolized our natural wealth. We're not going deep into that because it's obvious, it's given. But what I'm concerned about is us in the Middle East and the leaders who we have produced and the way they have been treating us. I could sit and criticize the West forever, deservedly so. I'm very familiar with that discourse. But for me, the time is to look back into ourselves. We are ancient people. We produce amazing civilizations. Why on earth we have not produced intelligent politicians, determined thinkers, in order to be able to sustain us from within? We still import Western concepts. And those kind of things, I'm very concerned, and that's my deep concern. But the injuries that the West has done and is doing is phenomenal. And I think West has to look into itself, and Westerners, about the moral and ethical responsibility about what the West has done. I'm not saying you are responsible, I'm responsible. But I think we need to develop a profound, independent way of thinking to critically engage with the structural powers that eating us alive in those places, from Iran, from Iraq, from Syria, from Egypt, and beyond. So this is the problem that we have, and I don't know where to go with it. And I'm not, it seems to be a few of us around. I like to look into my own problem. I'm the problem. Now I got all this knowledge about how to criticize the West. As a matter of fact, sometimes when we refer to Edward Said and Noam Chomsky and others, they are taught at our universities. And I keep saying, could Edward Said or Noam Chomsky, with the views that they criticize the West, teach at the University of Tehran or Baghdad and criticize so fervently about the oppression and things in Iran or things? Of course not. So those kind of things I think you should also reflect on, to think about how can we shift the argument, shift the paradigm about this West-East argument, colonization, decolonization, post-colonialism, and so forth and so forth. I hope I gave you something to reflect. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yep, one over there.
Howdy, Mehmet.
Hi, John. Great.
I found it very interesting your concept of the authentic exile and the characteristics of the authentic exile at a time when we're governed by a politic that's all about getting into power or staying in power. What's your thoughts about what an authentic politician might be, and how we can create a dialogue about building a collaborative society?
Good to hear your beautiful voice, Philip. I haven't heard from you for ages. Fantastic that you're here. I think you all have a good answer for this wonderful question. I mean, by everybody here. From someone who looks into, and sometimes I consciously go from deeply outside into inside, because whatever I do, I cannot be insider. I can't. I'm sorry. But I look deeply into this inside because I'm a citizen of this city. And good thinkers should do that all the time, whether you are Anglo, Italian, Maltese, Jewish or not. From that angle, I think our politicians are absolutely corrupt, whichever you look at it. Because the issue of authenticity, as we understand it, is really a commodity used by anyone that I hear it. It's a very profound term. Almost all our thinking based on these terms since old Greek, old man. So I think what I'd like to quickly say is, I think we have individually here responsible to reflect what does this term mean and what I do with it myself in relation to power. When do I wink? When I believe that I'm actually criticizing the power. We wink a lot here to power. Well, it's democracy. We can't just be violent or aggressive. But the only thing that you could say, maybe we could to look into our own conscience to say, am I dealing with this with good conscience? And I believe all of you do here. But we have to spread this deeper into the wider community. This is what I could simply offer.
I think we have time for one final question, if there's anyone. All right, nothing pertinent. I'd like to thank Mamad Aidani. Thank you so much for your wise words and for sharing your story with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.